At 0420 hours local time on the 15th of August, 2026, 6 FP-5 Flamingo missiles, roughly twice the size of a Tomahawk, were launched from a secret site in Ukraine's Sumy region. They climbed to an altitude of 150 feet, turned northeast, and headed toward the strategic Savasleyka air base in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod region. Behind them, 48 FP-1 UAVs were also launched with the same mission: to destroy the MiG-31 fighters stationed at the airbase. What the Ukrainian crews supporting the launchers did not know was that Russia had already detected them and deployed one of its most advanced air defense systems to intercept them, attempting to stop an attack on strategic bases deep inside Russian territory. If you looked at these missiles, they were almost like flying buses. A jet engine using technology from Soviet-era trainer aircraft pulled the entire airframe forward, buried deep inside the tail. What Russia truly had to fear was the enormous warhead it carried, weighing as much as 2,300 pounds. They spread out in flight to approach Savasleyka from multiple directions. Behind them, the UAVs dispersed in a similar pattern, almost like soldiers moving as an escort. The reason was simple. Classifying more than 50 targets approaching from 6 different directions was far more difficult than dealing with all of them coming from the same direction. A Russian radar operator watched intently as the antenna swept along the horizon, but the screen remained completely empty. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked on the outer edge of the scan. Then, a return suddenly flickered into view, extremely faint, very low, and so unusual that it almost should not have been there. The signals appeared for an instant, disappeared, then showed up again on the screen. 3 years of experience hunting drones had taught him that something was wrong. He immediately knew he had to report it to the command post. A radar return that kept appearing and disappearing was not random. It was trying to tell the operator that something was out there. 2 things were helping the FP-5 Flamingos hide themselves. Radar energy travels almost in a straight line while the Earth is curved. When a Flamingo flies only 150 feet above the ground, that is the entire trick. It can remain hidden behind the radar horizon. An S-400 system may be able to intercept a target at 250 miles, roughly the distance from New York to Washington, D.C. But it may not see this missile until it is only 20 miles away and almost inside its engagement zone. Most of the Flamingo's airframe uses fiberglass and composite materials instead of metal, producing a weaker radar return. But it is not completely invisible. The jet engine still contains many heat-resistant metal components, creating small radar reflections when the angle is right. That was what betrayed them that morning. The antenna swept past and saw only fields and sky. The flickering return disappeared. The missile disappeared with it. It had not been shot down. It had simply slipped out of the radar's line of sight once again. Flying low helped the Flamingos survive, but it came at a cost in fuel. At only 150 feet, the denser air created much more drag, forcing the jet engine to maintain greater thrust, even though the missiles still had 450 miles ahead of them. But that same altitude kept breaking Russia's detection chain. About 100 miles to the southwest, an S-400 Triumph battery finally held the signal long enough to generate a firing solution. 2 4ON-6E missiles left their launch tubes almost back-to-back, accelerated, and then dived toward the targets flying close to the ground. The 4ON-6E is one of the interceptor missiles integrated with the S-400 system. The first missile came down right on the flight path. It did not need a direct hit. The proximity fuse triggered the fragmentation warhead when the FP-5 entered the lethal zone. A cloud of steel fragments ripped across the composite airframe, destroying the control system and bringing down the first Flamingo. But the second 4ON-6E met a different target. Behind the FP-5 was an FP-1 carrying a Lüneburg lens radar reflector, amplifying its radar cross-section from only about 0.01 square meters to roughly 2 square meters, making the small UAV appear to be a much larger target. The seeker switched to the stronger return, and the proximity fuse triggered too early. The explosion tore apart the FP-1, but it happened before the fragmentation cloud could cover the Flamingo flying ahead. This was exactly where a long-range system like the S-400 faced its hardest problem. Its radar had a major advantage when targets appeared against a clean sky background. But at 150 feet, the missile signal became mixed with reflections from trees, buildings, and terrain. The radar horizon shortened the tracking window to only a few minutes, while the dozens of FP-1s behind kept generating additional targets that the system had to classify. Just a few seconds of error in selecting the correct signal could send a multi-million-dollar interceptor toward the wrong object. One Flamingo had been shot down, and one decoy FP-1 had disappeared, but 5 FP-5s in this group were still continuing on without damage. They dropped lower again to hug the terrain and kept heading towards Savasleyka. Russia had just proved that it could destroy a Flamingo, but Ukraine had also proved that to find the right missile among more than 50 low-flying targets, the S-400 might have to pay with the very things it valued most: time and interceptor missiles. The warning was immediately passed down to the next air defense layer. A Buk M3 battery swung its 9 S-36M radar toward the western corridor where the 5 Flamingos were coming in. Just seconds later, one FP-5 skimmed across an open patch of terrain and stayed visible long enough for the crew to build a track and prepare to launch a 9M317M missile. But just as the firing solution was nearly complete, the Flamingo reached its next waypoint and turned onto a new heading. This time, the problem was not stealth, it was trigonometry. A Doppler radar does not only measure how fast an object is flying, it is especially interested in the part of that velocity moving toward or away from the radar, known as radial velocity. The Flamingo was still racing ahead at 550 miles per hour, but when its flight path cut almost perpendicular to the Buk M3's line of sight, the number the radar saw dropped sharply. At an angle of 75 degrees, the missile's radial speed fell to only 48 miles per hour. At 89 degrees, it was less than 10 miles per hour. At exactly 90 degrees, mathematically, it became 0. For several scan cycles, the fastest object on the screen began to resemble something almost stationary relative to the ground. Its Doppler signature slipped into the zone where the clutter rejection filter was designed to remove trees, structures, and reflections with almost no movement. The track weakened and then disappeared before the 9 M317M ever left its tube. No electronic warfare had deceived the Buk M3. The Flamingo had simply crossed the radar beam at exactly the moment the algorithm was trying to distinguish a real target from the ground. What is worth noting is that Ukraine may not even have intended to create that moment. The zigzagging route between waypoints had been programmed to avoid air defense zones, but one accidental turn placed the Flamingo into the most favorable Doppler angle possible. A few seconds later, it appeared again, but by then the engagement window had already closed. The 5 Flamingos continued deeper into Russia, still flying at about 150 feet, still burning fuel faster than ideal, and still trading every gallon of fuel for a few more miles of concealment from radar. After escaping the Buk M3, the 5 Flamingos dropped back down to 150 feet. For nearly the next 25 minutes, Russia's ground-based radar network could not maintain a single stable track. One station saw a signal for a few seconds. Another picked up a contact dozens of miles away, and then everything disappeared again. On the command map, these scattered dots were not enough to determine whether they represented a single moving missile, several different UAVs, or simply interference. But at an altitude of around 30,000 feet, an A-50 patrolling over the Fabritny area was looking down on the same airspace from an entirely different angle. At first, even the A-50's Schmel radar could not see the Flamingo clearly. A small return appeared among UAVs, civilian aircraft, false targets, and countless reflections from the ground. The crew marked it only as an unknown track. On the next scan, the signal disappeared as the Flamingo passed over an area with strong background reflections, causing the weak return from the metal around its engine to sink into the clutter below. If it failed to reappear over the next few scans, the predicted search area would rapidly expand by miles, and Russia would no longer know where to send an interceptor. Then the Flamingo reached its next waypoint and changed direction. A small change in aspect angle caused the metal around the engine to reflect more energy back toward the A-50. A bright point appeared directly ahead of the last known position. The operator placed the 2 points on the same vector. Distance, time, and speed all matched an object moving at cruise missile speed. He immediately went back through the earlier data. One return in the west, another appearing several minutes later, farther east, the track the Book M3 had just lost, and now the current contact. When those dots were connected, they formed a single corridor leading directly towards Savasleyka. The track's priority level was immediately raised. This no longer looked like an ordinary reconnaissance UAV. The speed was too high, the trajectory too consistent, and it had maintained extremely low altitude for hundreds of miles. But just as the command center requested final confirmation, the signal began flickering again. One scan, nothing. A second scan, still empty. Instead of continuing to stare at the last known position, the A-50 crew used the speed, heading, recently observed waypoint, and previous track sequence to build a predicted search zone ahead. A few seconds later, a contact appeared right on the edge of that zone. It was no longer a guess. They were tracking the same cruise missile. The interception order was passed down. The A-50 continued maintaining the target picture and transmitted the coordinates, altitude, and approach vector to a MiG-31 from Savasleyka Air Base. The fighter's radar remained silent. It did not yet need to transmit to search for the target itself. The Flamingo continued flying below, completely unaware that for the first time since leaving Sumy, Russia not only knew where it was, it had begun calculating where it would appear. Several minutes later at Savasleyka, the MiG-31 pilot received the order to scramble immediately. The two D-30F6 engines went into afterburner, pushing the 40-ton interceptor off the runway. Throughout the process, the A-50 continued maintaining the track below and continuously transmitted the Flamingo's coordinates, altitude, speed, and movement vector. The MiG-31 climbed ahead of the predicted corridor, gained altitude and speed, then turned back toward the target, turning the pursuit into a head-on interception. When the distance was still 150 miles, the pilot launched an R-37M. The missile left the rail, accelerated beyond Mach 5, and dived from high altitude toward a target flying only 150 feet above the ground. The A-50 continued updating the target position during the mid-course phase. As the R-37M closed in, its own seeker took over. The proximity fuse triggered at a distance of 20 feet, sending a cloud of fragments across the FP-5's airframe, and the second Flamingo of the attack disappeared from the screen. The MiG-31 continued charging directly toward the remaining formation. When the distance dropped to around 50 miles, its radar and forward sensors acquired a clear target and an R-73 left the launch rail. Its infrared seeker locked onto the hot exhaust from the jet engine buried deep inside the FP-5's tail, then pulled the missile down toward the ground. The Flamingo tried to hold its waypoint, but could not evade a weapon with that level of maneuverability. The R-73 detonated beside the tail section, destroying the engine and control system. Ukraine recognized the threat almost immediately afterward. The remaining 47 FP-1s behind the formation climbed rapidly to 1,500 feet, increased power, and activated their radar reflection amplifiers as if the entire UAV swarm had suddenly entered its final attack phase. On the Zaslon display, the scattered small returns suddenly became dozens of prominent tracks at once. The MiG-31 had just been looking at a clean target picture. Now it was facing a crowd. The pilot pushed the nose down, cut through the edge of the formation, and switched to the 6-barrel 23mm GSH 623M cannon with about 260 rounds of ammunition at a firing rate of up to roughly 8,000 rounds per minute. Holding the trigger for 1 second could consume more than half the ammunition load. The cannon roared. Streams of 23mm rounds cut across the FP-1s, flight paths at more than half a mile per second. One lost a wing, another had its engine shattered, and then several more dots began dropping from the screen. The MiG-31 pulled up, turned around, and made another pass through the formation. By the time it exited on the other side, 16 FP-1s had been destroyed, but the remaining 31 immediately spread out, splitting across multiple directions and altitudes. Their numbers were beginning to work. Each UAV individually was not worth spending a long-range missile on, but all of them together forced the radar, the pilot, and the A-50 to divide their attention across dozens of tracks. And Russia did not have unlimited time to do that. Only one A-50 was maintaining the picture across an airspace hundreds of miles wide, while the MiG-31 had already used missiles, most of its cannon ammunition, and several minutes of high-power flight. The D-30F-6 afterburners gave it the speed needed to intercept the Flamingos, but they also burned fuel at a tremendous rate. The pilot checked the gauges. Fuel was approaching the point where he had to return. The cannon was nearly empty, and the remaining missiles were not enough to continue hunting individual targets inside the UAV swarm. He called ground command, reported his weapon status, and requested permission to disengage. A few seconds later, the order was approved. The MiG-31 pulled up, exited the corridor, and turned back towards Savasleyka. Below, 3 Flamingos and 31 FP-1s were still in the air. As the MiG-31 disappeared behind them, the 3 Flamingos dropped low again, held their waypoints, and continued another 100 miles deeper into Russia. But Russia's air defense network had far more than that. Electronic warfare stations were ordered to increase power, including Murmansk BN, a massive system designed for reconnaissance and suppression of HF communications in the 3 to 30 megahertz range with a reported effective range of up to 5,000 miles. If the Flamingo was still using any short wavelength link to receive commands or target updates from Ukraine, Murmansk BN could detect the signal and then flood that exact frequency band with interference. But the 3 FP-5s below were transmitting nothing back home. They did not even know that 2 of the missiles flying with them had just been destroyed by the MiG-31. From the moment they left Sumy, their mission was essentially to follow a preloaded sequence of waypoints. The more dangerous threat came from another GNSS jamming layer inside Russia's EW network. GPS does not operate inside Murmansk BN's HF range. Navigation signals such as GPS L1, L2, and L5 operate around 1.2 to 1.6 gigahertz, and by the time they reach the ground, they are extremely weak. Jamming stations only need to generate stronger energy at the receiver to collapse the signal-to-noise ratio. Inside the Flamingo's avionics compartment, satellite navigation accuracy began to degrade, but the guidance system did not immediately lose its sense of direction. A CRPA-style anti-jam antenna array could create electronic nulls toward ground-based jamming sources, while continuing to prioritize signals coming from the sky. If the interference still became too strong, the computer could simply stop trusting GNSS and rely more heavily on the INS. The INS did not need to listen to anyone. Its gyroscopes and accelerometers simply kept measuring how much the missile had turned, how much it had accelerated, and in what direction it had moved since the last update. Error would accumulate over time, but over a few dozen minutes, it could still keep the Flamingo inside a corridor close enough for the autopilot to correct toward the next waypoints. ArduPilot-style autopilot software handled the less dramatic but critical tasks, maintaining altitude, speed, bank angle, and transitioning from one waypoint to the next. Firepoint says its software system was designed to continue targeting in a heavy electronic warfare environment. Meanwhile, open sources currently do not confirm that the FP-5 uses a sophisticated IIR thermal imaging seeker in the terminal phase. So at this stage, it did not need to see Savasleyka. It only needed to keep flying toward the coordinates already programmed into it. And while Russia tried to make the 3 Flamingos lose their way, the radar picture became even worse. From other areas of Ukraine, including Kherson and Kharkiv, additional waves of low-cost UAVs and decoys appeared simultaneously along other approach axes. They did not need to penetrate the entire air defense network. They only needed to create more decisions. Every new track forced a Russian command post to ask 3 questions. What is it? Where is it going? And is it worth spending an interceptor missile on? An FP-1 worth tens of thousands of dollars might be ignored, or it might be masking something carrying a warhead weighing more than a ton. Firepoint publicly describes the FP-1 as a mass-produced deep strike platform, while the FP-5 carries a combat payload of up to 2,300 pounds. That was the real value of the cheapest targets in the sky that night. They did not need to defeat the S-400, Buk, M3, A-50, or MiG-31 with better technology. They only needed to force all of those systems to work at the same time. The 3 surviving Flamingos had no idea any of this was happening behind them. There was no pilot, no operator holding a joystick, and no data link back to Sumy reporting that the original formation had lost half its missiles. They continued at an altitude of about 150 feet, the INS silently counting every movement, the autopilot keeping the nose pointed toward the next waypoint, while the satellite receivers continuously searched for any clean signal that could break through the wall of interference. Russia had tried to take away their ground radar picture. Then it sent an interceptor aircraft. Now it was trying to take away their sense of direction as well. But the 3 Flamingos still did not change course, and ahead of them, Savasleyka was getting closer with every mile. But this was the moment when the final defensive line around Savasleyka began to see them. 10 miles west of the base perimeter, a Pantsir S-1 battery established a stable track on the leading FP-5. At that distance, there was not much radar horizon left to hide behind. The missile was flying almost straight into the sector protected by the Pantsir's radar. A 57 E-6 missile left the launch tube, its booster accelerating it past Mach 3, while the command guidance system continuously corrected its flight path by radio command. The Flamingo did not change course. It had no pilot, no missile warning system, and no idea it was being tracked. A few seconds later, the fragmentation warhead detonated close to the composite airframe. The wing was torn from the frame, the fuel ignited, and the FP-5 broke apart outside the base perimeter. But in the seconds the Pantsir spent dealing with the largest target, the 31 FP-1s behind it kept closing in. As they moved deeper in, using missiles against each small UAV was no longer the most efficient option. The crew switched to the twin 30mm, 2 A38M cannons, each firing at 2,500 rounds per minute. The 2 gun mounts slewed toward the UAV formation, and short bursts began cutting across the sky. One FP-1 lost its entire left wing. The second caught fire and plunged down. The streams of fire kept shifting from one target to another until 18 FP-1s disappeared from the screen in a very short span of time. The remaining UAVs could not continue flying straight like targets on a range. The 2 leading FP-1s broke away from the formation and changed course, no longer heading toward their original target area, but turning directly toward the Pantsir position itself. The first climbed another 700 feet, deliberately making its radar return cleaner. The second curved around from another angle and kept closing in. To the Russian crew, they immediately became the 2 nearest threats. The turret had to leave the main approach corridor. The radar shifted priority, and the 30mm bursts began sweeping off to the side. This was not an attempt for those 2 UAVs to survive. They only needed to make the Pantsir look the wrong way for a few seconds. The first FP-1 was torn apart before it could reach the defensive position. But, while the guns stayed on it, the second had already shortened the distance further. The Pantsir was forced to keep the firing line, continue traversing the guns, and destroy the second target just outside the base. Both suicide UAVs were destroyed. In return, they bought exactly what the UAVs behind them needed most: a short gap in the track and target switching cycle. During those few seconds, the surviving FP-1s shifted their axis of approach and slipped through the area the guns had just left uncovered. By the time the Pantsir turned back, the distance was no longer 10 miles. The remaining UAVs had already pushed into the few-mile zone around the base, where every second of delay could equal hundreds of feet of additional progress. After losing 18 to cannon fire and 2 more in the feint, 11 FP-1s were still pressing into Savasleyka together with the last 2 Flamingos. The Pantsir was still operating, the radar was still turning, the guns still had ammunition, but the battle had changed position. It was no longer being fought on the outer ring, where the air defense crew had time to detect and then choose how to engage. Now everything was rushing into the immediate defense zone around the base, and every target dealt with meant several others were advancing another few hundred yards. The air base was now directly ahead. The last two Flamingos broke through the innermost defensive layer, but the Panzer still had one more shot. Its radar held the nearest FP-5 and a 57E-6 left the launch tube. At a range of only a few miles, flight time was measured in seconds. The Flamingo held its waypoint, had no warning, and had no ability to evade. The proximity warhead detonated beside the midsection, tearing the wing from the composite airframe and turning the FP-5 into a burning ball of fuel outside the perimeter fence. Only one Flamingo remained. Behind it, the 11 FP-1s began climbing for their final dive. The twin 30mm 2 A38M cannons immediately elevated and swept upward. 3 UAVs were caught just as they made themselves more visible. One lost a wing, while the other two were torn apart by bursts of 30mm fire. But at this distance, the Panzer was no longer the only thing firing. Rifle and machine gun fire began erupting from guard towers around the airfield. Russian soldiers used AK-pattern rifles and machine guns to lay down dense bands of fire toward the FP-1s as they dropped lower. At speeds of more than 100 miles per hour, the firing window lasted only a few seconds, but the range was now close enough that even infantry fire became dangerous. 4 more FP-1s were shot down before they could cross the final security zone, but by the time the guns shifted to the next targets, it was already too late. The last Flamingo and the 4 remaining FP-1s had crossed the perimeter. The FP-5 drove straight into the MiG-31 operating area. Its roughly 2,300-pound warhead penetrated the hangar area before detonating, destroying surrounding structures and causing severe damage to the aircraft inside. Almost simultaneously, the 4 FP-1s dived onto separate points. One struck the fuel area, the second penetrated a hangar, the third detonated on the runway area, and the last hit the parking and technical support zone. The strike on the fuel facility produced the largest fire. Fuel, ground vehicles, and other combustible materials began igniting in sequence, creating secondary explosions after the initial impact. Thick black smoke quickly spread across part of the airfield, while debris and impact craters forced runway operations to be interrupted. Ukraine had launched 6 Flamingos and 48 FP-1s. Most of them never reached the target. They were hunted throughout the journey by S-400s, Buk M3s, MiG-31s, electronic warfare, Panzers, and finally even infantry fire. But that was also the point of the attack. The air defense network did not need to fail completely. It only needed to let one missile carrying a warhead, weighing more than a ton, and a few UAVs get through. In a war of attrition, sometimes an entire defensive network only needs to be a few seconds late at exactly the wrong moment for the cost to appear directly on the runway. If you found the way Ukraine used low-cost UAVs to open a path for larger weapons noteworthy, let me know in the comments. In your opinion, which moment was the decisive turning point of this attack? And if you want to keep following these battles between modern offensive weapons and air defense systems, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video. Goodbye.